Welcome to episode 135 of OTD, your daily dose of soccer history by 17 Lost Guy. It's March 15, 1970, and today's story is about a scoreline so extreme that the Copa Libertadores has still never really caught up with it. Because on this day in 1970, Peñarol beat Valencia of Venezuela 11-2 in Montevideo. 11. Not over 2 legs, not an aggregate, but in one match. It remains the biggest win in Libertadores history, the most goals one club has ever scored in a Libertadores match, and the only game in the competition's history in which one side has reached double digits. What makes it even stranger is the timing, because just 4 days earlier, River Plate had beaten Universitario de La Paz by 9-0, setting what looked like a new standard for continental destruction. And then Peñarol came along and went even further, just 4 days later. 2 9-goal margin wins within 4 days of each other in the same edition of Libertadores. It feels less like statistics and more like the tournament briefly leaving the realm of normal football. But this is not just a crazy score episode, it's a Peñarol episode. In Libertadores history, that means something, because by 1970, Peñarol were already one of the great institutional pillars of the competition. They had won the very first Copa Libertadores in 1960. They had won it again in 61. They had won it a third time in 66. And before this campaign even began, they had already reached 5 finals in the first 10 editions of the tournament, more than anyone else. So even though 1970 sits in the middle of Estudiantes' era, with the Argentines chasing a third straight title, Peñarol was still one of the clubs that gave Libertadores its early seriousness, prestige, and mythology. And on this night in Montevideo, they produced the most excessive scoreline the competition has ever seen. But how did we get here? To understand the match, you have to understand Peñarol first. Peñarol were not just another big South American club entering another group stage. By 1970, they were already one of the defining names of the Copa Libertadores. They had been there at the beginning. They had played the first match in the competition's history. They had won the first title. And in the first decade of Libertadores, they were everywhere. This mattered because early Libertadores still needed institutions that people recognized, followed, and feared. And Peñarol were one of those institutions. Along with Santos, Nacional, River, Independiente, and later Estudiantes, they helped turn the competition from an idea into a habit. By 1970, the cast changed somewhat. Estudiantes were the reigning back-to-back champions, and the continental center of gravity had shifted. But Peñarol still carried immense weight. They were not living on nostalgia. This was still a serious side, full of serious names, like Ladislao Masukiewicz in goal, Pablo Forlan at the back, Roberto Matosas, Pedro Rocha, Alberto Spencer, Hermindo Onega, and Julio Lozada. And just pause there for a second, because 2 of those names tell you exactly why this match still matters in Libertadores memory. Spencer remains to this day the all-time top scorer in Copa Libertadores history, and Pedro Rocha still sits third on that all-time list. And both scored on this day in 1970. That is legacy meeting spectacle. Valencia, meanwhile, were not one of the old continental powers, but they were not random bystanders either. They had qualified from Venezuela and had already shown enough in the group to avoid being treated as comic relief. They had beaten Deportivo Galicia. They had drawn 0-0 with Peñarol in Valencia. They were a serious enough domestic side that not long after this, they would go on to win the Venezuelan league title in 1971. So this was not supposed to be 11. A heavy defeat, perhaps. A class gap, yes, but not this. And then the match began, and the whole thing tilted instantly. And this is where one of the small but important corrections matter. A lot of later match summaries placed the first goal in the 10th minute, but that's wrong. The opener came in the first minute, effectively within the first half minute. Julio Lozada burst down the left, crossed, and fouled Alberto Spencer free in front of goal, and Spencer headed in, 1-0. And right there, after 30 seconds, the tone was set. Spencer scored again soon after to make it 2. Julio Lozada made it 3. Nilo Acuña added the 4th. And Pedro Rocha made it 5. So by halftime, it was already 5-1, and the match was gone. But Peñarol did not stop. They scored 6 more in the second half, Losada again, and Rocha with 2 more goals to complete his hat-trick. Valdemar Caceres, and Amino Onega with 2. So final score, 11-2. The goals were spread across the side in a way that makes the whole thing feel even more overwhelming. This was not one man scoring 6 while everyone else watched. And that tells you something important about Peñarol in this period. Even in a match that became absurd, the absurdity came from structure as much from chaos. They had too much quality, too much movement, and too much confidence, and too much know-how. There's also a vivid line in one of the later retellings that helps explain the feel of the night. Valencia's goalkeeper, Dario Colmenares, was said to have become nervous after that first-minute goal, while teammates seemed to disappear around him. For Peñarol, it became less a contest than a long exercise in finishing. And that phrase is cruel, but it captures the mood. Because once the first few goals went in, this stopped looking like elite continental tension and started looking like the collapse of one football reality into another. Yet within the madness, the details matter. The first 2 goals were Spencer's, and that is not just a nice historical flourish. It fits perfectly with what Spencer was in Libertadores history, the great early marksman of the competition, the man who turned continental scoring into a personal territory. Rocha scoring 2 matters for the same reasons. Between them, the first and the third highest scores in Libertadores history both left fingerprints on the biggest round the tournament has ever seen. That is why this match is more than an outlier. It is one of those strange football nights where record, institution, and individual legacy all collide in the same 90 minutes. So what? In the short term, it meant Peñarol kept moving. They advanced. They went through the later stages. They reached the final. And there, they ran into the defining force of that moment, Estudiantes de La Plata. Estudiantes beat them. That part matters, because it keeps the story anchored in its real historical place. This was not the beginning of a Peñarol renaissance. This was a great violent burst of Peñarol power inside someone else's era. But Peñarol being there at all also tells you something. They kept returning. They kept reappearing. They kept behaving like one of those clubs in Libertadores history cannot really tell itself without. And even now, that remains true. Their last final came in 2011, and they remain the last Uruguayan club to have reached the Libertadores final. Valencia's story is different. For them, this became one of those results a club can never quite shake. It was the worst defeat ever suffered by a Venezuelan side in Libertadores, and it still lives there in continental memory. But it did not erase the club completely. They were back in Libertadores in 72 and 74, and in 71, as already mentioned, they won the Venezuelan league title. So the club did not vanish under the weight of this one humiliation. It absorbed it and kept going, at least for a time. And then there's the wider record book question. Have there been more 9-goal margin wins in Libertadores since March 1970? No. That is part of what makes these few days in 1970 feel so surreal. River's 9-0 over Universitario de La Paz on March 11 and Peñarol's 11-2 over Valencia on March 15, 1970 are still the only 2 9-goal margin wins in the history of the competition. There have been brutal results since. Santos beat Bolivar 8-0 in 2012. River Plate beat Jorge Wilstermann 8-0 in 2017. River then beat Alianza Lima 8-1 in 2022. And Cruzeiro beat Universidad de Chile 7-0 in 2018. So the tournament has still produced the occasional demolition, but nobody has reached 9 again, and nobody has scored 10 or 11. That line remains guarded by Peñarol alone. And maybe that is the best way to understand March 15, 1970. Not simply as a freak result, not only as Valencia's disaster, but as one of those rare nights when a great club at full continental voltage pushes the score beyond what the tournament itself seems designed to contain. Peñarol had pedigree, Peñarol had players, and Peñarol had history. And for one night in Montevideo, all of it came together in the most excessive scoreline Libertadores has ever known. Before we go, 3 things to take away from March 15, 1970. First, Peñarol's 11-2 over Valencia is not just the biggest win in Libertadores history, it is also the only match in which one club has scored double digits. And second, the match matters even more because it sits inside Peñarol's larger place in Libertadores history, as the first champion, an early serial finalist, and one of the clubs that gave the tournament its original stature. And third, when Alberto Spencer and Pedro Rocha both score in the biggest rout the competition has ever seen, the match stops being just a bizarre scoreline and becomes part of the tournament's deeper mythology. On this day in 1970, Peñarol beat Valencia of Venezuela 11-2 in Montevideo, the biggest win and highest scoring performance in Copa Libertadores history, achieved by one of the competition's foundational clubs and still unmatched more than a half-century later. That's all for episode 135 of OTD, your daily dose of soccer history by 17 Lost Guy. If you enjoyed this episode, please follow the show, leave a rating, and share it with a fellow football historian. Tomorrow, we step away from scorelines and trophies and into something much darker. March 16, 1938, when the bombing of Barcelona made FC Barcelona collateral damage in a wider human catastrophe during the Spanish Civil War. See you tomorrow.